Evan Carter opened his door on an ordinary gray morning, expecting nothing more than another quiet day. But everything shifted the moment he saw his two aunts Margaret and Elaine standing together in the hallway, looking uneasy and strangely united. They had never arrived at the same time, never driven across town in silence, and never worn expressions that carried so much tension. Their eyes held a seriousness that made Evan's stomach twist, because even before they stepped inside, he sensed their visit was not casual or routine. As they walked into his small apartment, brushing rain from their coats, Evan felt the air tighten around them, as if they had brought a storm with them. The soft patter of rain against the windows made the room feel smaller, warmer, and filled with something unsaid. They stood near his kitchen counter for a moment, almost as if rehearsing what to say, and he waited, unsure whether to offer coffee or brace himself for news. Margaret, the more outspoken one, finally cleared her throat, though her voice trembled in a way he hadn't heard before. She called him sweetheart, the way she had when he was young. But this time, it didn't sound comforting, it sounded like she needed him. Elaine, usually calm and composed, held a thin folder against her chest like it was fragile or private. Evan noticed her fingers tightening around the edges, as if letting go might break something. They exchanged glances with each other, not with him, which instantly told him that whatever they brought today, they had talked about it before coming, maybe even argued, maybe even struggled to agree. The weight of that unspoken backstory pulled him in, creating a hook of curiosity that made him sit straighter. He asked what was wrong, but neither answered right away, and that silence, stretched between three people who shared so much history, felt louder than any explanation they could have given. When they finally spoke, it wasn't about health, money, or family troubles, things he had quietly prepared himself for within the few seconds after opening the door. Instead, they said they needed his help with something important, and somehow that felt even more frightening. They both looked at him with a mix of hope and fear, and he realized this wasn't something easy they could discuss over lunch. It was something delicate, personal. He gestured for them to sit, and as they settled on his couch, he noticed the exhaustion on their face is not physical exhaustion, but the emotional kind that comes from carrying a secret too long. The apartment filled with the sound of the rain and the faint hum of the refrigerator, ordinary noises that only made the moment feel bigger. Evan tried to lighten the mood, but neither aunt smiled, not even politely. Instead, Elaine inhaled slowly and admitted they had grown distant from each other after Evan's mother, her sister, passed away. The confession softened the room, touching a memory that lived deep in Evan's heart. His mother had been the glue holding the family together, and without her, everyone had drifted into separate corners of life. Now his aunts sat before him, trying to bridge a gap they had allowed to widen for years. And for some reason, they chose today. They chose him. Margaret took a small envelope from her purse and placed it on the table, sliding it toward Evan with a shaking hand. Elaine followed by setting her own folder beside it. It's two different stories, two different lives, but both directed at him. They told him they hadn't planned to visit on the same day. They didn't even know the other had something to confess. Yet somehow they ended up on his doorstep together. Driven by the same unexpected reasons, something involving love, something involving new chances, something they were afraid to face alone. Evan blinked at the word love, unsure he heard correctly. His aunts were strong, independent women who didn't usually talk about romance, especially not with him. But now they looked at him like they needed him to guide them through something deeply personal. The moment felt surreal, almost impossible to believe. Instead of explaining everything at once, they asked him to listen first, promising the details would come with time. Their voices cracked, not from sadness, but vulnerability, a kind he had rarely seen from them. For a second, Evan couldn't tell whether they were more afraid of the future they were stepping toward or the past they were reopening. He opened his mouth to ask questions, but Margaret lifted her hand gently, signaling him to wait. She said, They came because they trusted him, because his mother would want them to come to him. Because sometimes life brings you back to the people who feel safe when you're unsure of your own heart. Her words shook something inside him. He had always seen his aunts as pillars, steady, unshakable, endlessly capable. But seeing them like this, fragile and uncertain, reminded him that even the strongest people have moments where they don't know the next step. And in that moment, he realized the visit wasn't only about what they carried, was also about what they had lost between them and what they hoped to recover. The sky outside darkened as the rain grew heavier, tapping the windows with restless rhythm. The room seemed to pulse with the weight of the moment. Evan hadn't asked for any of this, yet he felt pulled in, connected, responsible. His aunts weren't only seeking advice. They were seeking connection, maybe even healing. And now, with 2 envelopes of secrets on his coffee table and 2 expectant hearts watching him, he felt the first stirrings of a journey he never saw coming. He didn't know what those envelopes contained or why they chose him. But he knew, without fully understanding how, that the next steps would change all of them. And the story, whatever it was only beginning. A heavy silence filled Evan's small living room as his aunts sat across from him, their hands folded tightly in their laps, their eyes shifting between him and the 2 envelopes on the table. The rain tapped softly against the windows, and even that quiet sound felt like part of the tension hanging in the room. Evan could feel something changing, something deeper than a simple visit, and his curiosity grew sharper as he waited for one of them to explain. It was Elaine who finally broke the silence, speaking in a low, careful voice, admitting that she and Margaret had been distant from each other since Evan's mother passed away. It wasn't just physical distance, it was emotional distance too, a drifting that happened slowly over the years. Hearing her say it aloud made the room feel heavier, reminding Evan of the empty place in his heart where his mother used to be. But before he could respond, Margaret leaned forward, her expression soft but serious, explaining that they weren't here to talk about the past or to reopen old pain. They were here because they both needed his help with something they had kept quiet for too long. Evan's attention snapped to the 2 envelopes again, suddenly wondering what could be so important that both his aunts showed up without warning. On the same day, Margaret slid 1 envelope closer to him, and Elaine placed her folder beside it, each one carrying its own weight, its own story. They exchanged a quick look, the kind that said they still weren't entirely comfortable sharing this in front of each other. That alone told Evan this was something personal, something delicate. He picked up the first envelope, feeling the slight tremble in his fingers, and asked again what this was about. Margaret spoke before Elaine could say anything, her voice, quiet but steady, telling him that this wasn't about money or health or some hidden family issue. It was about love, something neither of them had talked about in years. Evan blinked, almost certain he misunderstood, but both women nodded slowly, confirming it. Love, romance, the kind of things he never imagined his aunts discussing with him, especially not together. Margaret explained that the letter inside her envelope came from someone she once cared about deeply, someone she hadn't seen in decades. He had reached out unexpectedly, stirring up old feelings she thought were long gone. She didn't know if she should respond, and she felt strange, carrying it alone. Before Evan could fully absorb that, Elaine took a deep breath and admitted that the folder she brought carried her own stories, someone she met recently. Someone she liked, but fear had kept her from moving forward. She said she didn't know how to handle the idea of trying again after so many years of staying on her own. Evan sat back, trying to process the fact that both his aunts had come to him separately, but on the same day, asking for help with matters of the heart. It felt almost unreal, like life had thrown him into a story he didn't see coming. They both watched him closely, waiting for a reaction, their faces hopeful and anxious in a way that struck him deeply. They explained they weren't asking him to decide between the men or choose which path they should take. They wanted his guidance, his presence, his honesty. They wanted him to help them think clearly, to help them understand their own hearts. Because stepping into something new, especially, love felt intimidating after so many years of living carefully and quietly. Evan felt a strange mix of surprise, pressure, and tenderness. These were the women who raised him after his mother passed, who stood by him during the hardest moments of his life, and now they were looking at him as someone they trusted enough to reveal their fears to. He opened the first envelope and saw the letter inside, written in neat, thoughtful handwriting, filled with a tone of regret and hope. He didn't read all of it at once, but the first few lines were enough to understand how emotional it must have been for Margaret to receive it. He glanced at Elaine's folder, noticing a photograph of a man with gentle eyes, someone who looked like he had his own quiet stories. The realization hit him both women were carrying something heavy, something they didn't want to face alone. And even though they had become distant from each other, life had somehow brought them to the same crossroads on the same day, pulling them toward him for help. Evan asked why they didn't talk to each other about this first, and both lowered their eyes. Margaret admitted she was afraid Elaine would judge her for thinking about rekindling an old connection, while Elaine confessed she didn't want Margaret to think she was being foolish for liking someone new. They had been holding themselves back, hiding parts of their hearts from each other because they didn't know how to be vulnerable anymore, after years of distance. Evan felt a deep ache in his chest as he looked at the two women who had always seemed strong. Now they were letting him see their uncertainty, their fear of being hurt, their longing for companionship. It made him see them differently, not as authority figures or caretakers, but as human beings with feelings and hopes they had buried for too long. He knew he couldn't give them immediate answers, but he could give them understanding. Kay could. Listen, he could help them rebuild trust with each other and with themselves. As the rain outside eased and the light in the room softened, Evan realized this moment wasn't only about romance for them. It was about healing old barriers, reconnecting as family, and trusting that life still had meaningful chapters to offer, even later in life. And as he looked at the envelopes again, he felt the beginning of a responsibility he hadn't expected but couldn't walk away from. His aunts needed him not to solve their problems, but to walk beside them as they reopened the doors of their hearts, and just like that, part 2 of their story opened a path none of them saw coming. One that would lead to choices, courage, and secrets finally spoken. Evan sat quietly as the room seemed to hum with anticipation, his aunt's stories pressing toward him like a tide he couldn't ignore. Margaret's envelope lay open on the coffee table, its contents spilling emotions he could almost feel through the paper. The words from Henry Dalton, her first love, carefully written, full of nostalgia, regret, and hope. He read them slowly, sensing the careful honesty behind every line, the weight of memories that had never faded, and the hesitation that came from decades of distance. Margaret watched him, her fingers twisting in her lap, her eyes reflecting fear that she might be judged for feeling again after so long. Then Elaine spoke, reaching for her folder, her hands trembling as she pulled out the photograph of Paul, the man she had met at a community event, whose gentle smile seemed to hide a story of his own. She confessed that she had avoided calling him back because she was afraid that reopening her heart might lead to disappointment, and afraid of showing vulnerability after years of guarding herself. Evan listened to them both, feeling a tug in his chest he hadn't expected. These were women who had always been pillars in his life, strong and dependable. And now they were laying bare a side of themselves they had never shared. It wasn't just about romance. It was about reclaiming pieces of their own lives that had been set aside, about daring to feel again despite the fear of failure or heartbreak. He realized that what they needed wasn't someone to choose for them, but someone to reflect their courage back to them, someone to help them trust their own feelings. Margaret admitted that seeing Henry's letter had brought back everything she thought she had left behind: the laughter, the dreams, and even the hurt, but it also sparked a curiosity and longing she hadn't felt in years. Elaine's eyes, shone with a mixture of hope and fear as she described how Paul had seemed patient, kind, and attentive, qualities she admired but had been too cautious to explore. Evan could feel the tension between past and present, between familiarity and newness, and it created an urgency in the room, as if life had condensed decades into this one conversation. He reached for Margaret's hand briefly, not to comfort her, but to acknowledge the bravery it took to confront a past love, and she looked at him, surprised by his quiet support. Elaine followed, leaning slightly toward him, and he offered a reassuring nod. Recognizing that her hesitation wasn't weakness, but a form of self-preservation that had served her well until now. As the rain outside turned into a soft drizzle, the atmosphere inside Evan's apartment shifted. The envelopes on the table were no longer just paper. They were symbols of choices waiting to be made, doors waiting to be opened, hearts daring to feel again. He asked questions gently, probing not for answers but for feelings. What did Henry's words make you feel? What did seeing Paul's photograph stir in you? Both aunts spoke with hesitation at first, then with increasing clarity, revealing not only their desires but also their fears. The memories they had tucked away and the longings they hadn't allowed themselves to voice. Evan realized that helping them wasn't about choosing one path over another, but about guiding them to recognize their own courage and truth. As he listened, he felt a connection forming, not just with the stories, but with the emotions that lay beneath them, the vulnerability, the hope, the anticipation. He saw in Margaret's eyes the possibility of rekindling something she had never truly let go of. And in Elaine's eyes, the excitement of exploring new beginnings despite the risk of disappointment. They asked him what he thought, and he struggled, for a moment, knowing that any words he spoke could either empower them or add to their fear. Finally, he told them that both paths held value, that both men represented different aspects of love, one a chance to revisit the past with wisdom, the other a chance to embrace the unknown with openness. Margaret's fingers relaxed slightly, her shoulders dropping as if a weight had lifted, while Elaine's eyes glistened, a soft smile forming as the tension in her chest eased. The room felt warmer, infused with a sense of possibility and a gentle excitement that hadn't been there before. Evan watched as they processed his words, their expressions shifting from anxiety to reflection, realizing that the true decision lay within themselves, not in anyone else's hands. Margaret admitted that she had been afraid to trust her own heart again, and Elaine revealed that she had been avoiding disappointment by staying silent. By acknowledging these fears aloud, they allowed themselves a step closer to clarity, a step toward emotional courage that Evan had only hoped to witness. He felt proud and protective, not in a controlling way, but as someone who deeply cared for their happiness and growth. The rain outside began to fade completely, leaving a quiet stillness that mirrored the contemplative mood inside. Evan looked at both of them and realized that life had brought them to this moment not by coincidence but by necessity. A moment where honesty and emotion converged, and where past regrets and present possibilities met. Margaret took a slow breath and smiled faintly, a smile that held both apprehension and relief, while Elaine mirrored the gesture, a mix of tenderness and hope softening her features. Evan understood that the room once filled with uncertainty and tension now held a fragile sense of resolution and anticipation. It wasn't resolution in the sense that decisions had been made, but resolution in the courage they had shown by sharing, by admitting vulnerability, and by trusting him to guide them without judgment. As he looked from one to the other, Evan felt a strange shift in himself, a quiet stirring of his own heart that he hadn't expected. Helping them confront love, desire, and possibility awakened something in him, too. A recognition of the importance of taking emotional risks, of embracing feelings that had been quietly waiting for acknowledgement. He realized that the journey he had been drawn into wasn't just theirs, it was his as well. A journey into understanding, empathy, and the possibility of connection that went beyond family ties. For the first time that day, he felt a sense of purpose and clarity, knowing that his role wasn't to direct or decide, but to witness, support, and help them reflect on their hearts honestly. The aunts exchanged a glance, and he could see the relief and trust building between them. A bridge forming over years of distance, their connection strengthening in the shared moment of openness. Margaret's hand hovered over hers as if to reach for Elaine's, but stopped, hesitant yet full of intention, while Elaine's eyes softened, recognizing the shared bond and understanding that they were not alone in their journey, that they could explore their own desires without shame or secrecy. Evan felt the pulse of life in the room, a quiet but powerful energy that promised change, growth, and possibility. He realized that, by opening up, both women had reclaimed a part of themselves they had set aside. And in doing so, they had invited him into a chapter of their lives that would shape all three of them profoundly. The letters and the photograph lay on the table, but they were more than just paper. They were the embodiment of courage, hope, and the chance to rediscover hearts that had been dormant for far too long. And as he looked at them, Evan understood that this was not just a conversation, not just a fleeting moment. It was the beginning of a journey into vulnerability, love, and trust, a journey that would test, challenge, and ultimately transform all three lives in ways none of them could have anticipated, leaving him eager, anxious, and entirely captivated by the unfolding story before him. The rain had stopped outside, leaving the streets glistening under the soft glow of the late afternoon sun, and inside Evan's apartment, the atmosphere felt charged with a mix of relief, anticipation, and quiet excitement. His aunts, Margaret and Elaine, had spent hours unfolding their hearts, sharing fears, memories, and longings that had been buried for decades. And now the weight of those confessions lingered in the room like a delicate tension, waiting for the next step. Evan could see it in their faces. Margaret's eyes still shimmered with the possibility of reconnecting with Henry, the first love who had reappeared in her life after so many years. And Elaine's gaze held a soft, hopeful curiosity about Paul, the gentle man who had sparked her heart despite her caution. Both women had come to him not for answers or judgment, but for presence, guidance, and reassurance. And in seeing their vulnerability, Evan felt a profound mixture of responsibility, empathy, and admiration for the courage they displayed. They were leaving soon, returning to their separate lives, yet the room felt suspended in that fragile space between the past and the future, where emotions hung in the air, heavy and alive. Margaret reached out and touched Evan's arm briefly, a gesture both tender and reassuring, and whispered her thanks, acknowledging that having him listen and understand had given her the strength she didn't know she still possessed. Elaine followed with a gentle smile, her hands clasping his, lightly conveying trust, hope, and the quiet relief of sharing something deeply personal with someone who cared. Evan realized that in this room, in this moment, his role had transformed, from observer to a kind of anchor, someone who could hold space for their fears, their hopes, and their emotional rebirth. He reminded them gently that the paths they were considering, Margaret reconnecting with Henry and Elaine, exploring a new connection with Paul, were not about right or wrong, but about embracing life fully, daring to love despite the uncertainties and risks, and allowing themselves to feel again without guilt or hesitation. Margaret inhaled slowly, a shiver running through her as she admitted that she had feared revisiting a love from the past, worried it might reopen old pain or lead to disappointment. Yet, seeing it through Evan's calm/supportive eyes had made her feel courage she hadn't expected to find. Elaine's cheeks flushed slightly as she confessed that she had resisted the excitement Paul brought into her life, afraid of the unknown, yet she felt lighter now, realizing that taking a chance was part of living and loving, and that fear need not control her decisions. Evan felt a stirring in his own heart as he watched them, a quiet recognition that vulnerability and openness were contagious, and that witnessing their emotional bravery awakened something within him as well, a desire to embrace honesty, tenderness, and connection in his own life. He urged them to promise themselves that no matter what happened, they would not close their hearts again, that they would allow themselves to feel deeply and pursue what brought joy, companionship, and love, whether in familiar places from the past or unexpected new encounters. The room seemed to exhale collectively as both aunts nodded, eyes meeting his in a shared understanding. A silent pact to honor their feelings, to take the next steps with courage and authenticity, and to support each other as they ventured into emotional territory they had long avoided. Margaret's fingers hovered over the envelope containing Henry's letter, then slowly closed around it, a symbolic gesture of readiness to respond, to explore, and to embrace a story that had paused decades ago but now offered the promise of renewal. Elaine tucked her folder closer, a protective but hopeful movement signifying that she was prepared to reach out, to explore a connection that might bring joy, companionship, and perhaps even love into her life, no longer shackled by fear or hesitation. Evan watched both gestures quietly, aware that the moment was fragile yet transformative. A turning point where past regrets and future possibilities intertwined, and where the choices they would make next could reshape their lives in subtle but profound ways. He reminded them once more that they didn't need to rush, that life had a way of guiding those willing to be brave, and that they could take one step at a time, listening to their hearts and trusting their instincts. The sunlight streaming through the window caught the edges of Margaret's hair, highlighting the resilience and grace she carried, while Elaine's eyes reflected a softness and warmth that had always been there but was now ready to be shared more fully with the world. As the conversation drew to a close, Evan felt a quiet satisfaction mixed with anticipation, knowing that this day, this encounter, had been the catalyst for something new in all three of their lives. Margaret rose first, adjusting her coat and offering Evan a final smile, one that carried gratitude, relief, and the subtle thrill of a heart willing to try again. Elaine followed, pausing at the doorway to look back, her expression filled with trust and an almost playful curiosity about what the future might hold. A small spark in her eyes that told Evan she was ready to embrace whatever came next. The door closed behind them. Evan sank into his chair, the room suddenly quieter, yet charged with the echoes of their emotions and the promise of journeys beginning beyond those walls. He stared at the envelopes and the photograph, realizing that what had started as a simple visit had transformed into a pivotal moment. A shared experience of vulnerability, hope, and courage that would ripple through their lives. As he reflected on the events of the day, he recognized that love, both old and new, was not only about finding someone else, but also about finding oneself, about trusting in the capacity to feel, to risk, and to embrace possibility even after disappointment or long periods of waiting. He thought about the subtle ways Margaret and Elaine had relied on him, not for answers, but for validation, for presence, and for the gentle affirmation that their feelings mattered and were worth exploring. That realization filled him with warmth and a quiet pride, a recognition of the importance of family, trust, and emotional support in guiding those he loved through vulnerable moments. And yet, even as the apartment settled into silence, Evan felt a flutter of anticipation for what lay ahead, a sense that the next chapters of their lives, and perhaps his own, were beginning, filled with opportunities to love, to connect, and to experience the fullness of life's emotional richness. He understood that Margaret and Elaine were taking steps into the unknown, and in doing so, they were reminding him of the courage inherent in human hearts, the resilience that allows people to open themselves to love despite past fears, and the beauty of moments when hearts align in trust, understanding, and hope. As evening fell, the sky painted in soft hues of pink and gold, Evan stood by the window looking out at the quiet street and felt a mixture of serenity and expectancy. The rain-soaked streets mirrored the cleansing of old fears, the fading Light reflected the warmth of possibilities, and the gentle hush in the air carried the subtle magic of beginnings. He realized that what had started as a surprise visit had evolved into a transformative experience, one that would remain with them all, shaping choices, deepening connections, and inviting courage in ways they had not imagined before. Evan knew that the stories Margaret and Elaine had shared were only the beginning, that their hearts were now set on paths filled with emotion, discovery, and the quiet thrill of vulnerability, and that in guiding them, listening to them, and witnessing their courage, he had become part of something far larger than a single conversation. The day had ended, but the journey was far from over, and Evan felt the gentle pull of what was to come. Aware that each step they took in their separate yet intertwined paths would carry the echoes of this moment. A moment charged with hope, love, and the quiet promise of hearts ready to embrace life fully again.